The top-down Zelda formula has changed, but how exactly have Aonuma and team constituted the new formula, and what does this tell us about the future of the Zelda series as a whole? Which elements are from the Wild games? What has remained true to the deep traditions of the Zelda series? And where are Grezzo and Nintendo charting their own path forward? Settle in for a Nintendo Forecast deep dive into the new formula for top-down Zelda and its implications for the wider world of Hyrule. So let's dive in, and first up let's acknowledge the extent to which Echoes of Wisdom, while being a title in its own right and a title in its own genre, is very much influenced by the huge legacy of Breath of the Wild. Even from the very first trailer, it is clear that Zelda is getting her own Breath of the Wild moment as she escapes from a cave and runs over to a cliff edge, gazing from the hilltop upon the vast kingdom of Hyrule. And the game incorporates features from the other games, including, as confirmed in the trailers, some of the different civilizations we've seen, such as the Zora, in this case both the Sea and River Zora. It seems to me very clear that Echoes of Wisdom was designed as, so to speak, an echo of Breath of the Wild. This makes sense on a few levels. First of all, Breath of the Wild was enormously successful, so it's a reference point that will make sense to a lot of Zelda fans on Switch, and because Breath of the Wild has sold over 32 million copies, that is a huge number of people. Secondly, the Zelda team likes to find models for games when they're starting something new. They looked at Wind Waker when they were considering the open world possibilities of Zelda, and they used the city of Kyoto's map as a model for the map of the Hyrule of the Wild, since it's matched the kind of scale and scope they were going for in Breath of the Wild. However, because this game is smaller in scale, things are not exactly the same, and in many ways this feels like a diorama replicating a Breath of the Wild style adventure, not just in looks, but in spirit. A great example of this is the smoothies mechanic. In Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, you can gather scores of ingredients and combine them in multiple ways to create a range of recipes and potions, and sometimes dubious food using cooking pots dotted around Hyrule, or even ones you've created yourself using Ultra Hand. In Echoes of Wisdom, there is a more limited range of items you can collect, and combining two of these will net you a smoothie. There are a fair number of different smoothies you can make, a few dozen perhaps, but Tears of the Kingdom has over 200 ingredient types which can be combined in 5 ways each, leading to literally billions of potential combinations, though as far as people can tell, they only result in around 220 discrete recipes. I'm indebted to this spreadsheet from the Tears of the Kingdom Reddit link below for compiling this data. This is an example of how Nintendo took a key mechanic from Breath of the Wild, removed the key idea, and shrank it down. Another example, of course, is the inclusion of camps of monsters dotted around the map, with treasure chests to be found by clearing them all. I think it's a pity that the cross-pollination didn't extend to overworld bosses as well, as they're always good fun, but I wouldn't be surprised if this is something they consider in the future. I'd give a 30% chance to the next top-down Zelda having at least one overworld boss, given that it seems low-hanging fruit to bring across into the Zelda 2D space. But while we'll circle back to some of this stuff, I think we really need to start by zoning in on the key gameplay mechanics. In this case, the Echo abilities, but also the abilities that surround them, such as Bind and the Sword Fighter form. Clearly, the concept of having a set of abilities presented to the player right at the start, which then form the foundation of puzzles throughout the game, is taken straight from the playbook of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. In fact, one of the earlier videos on my channel drilled into exactly how the new Zelda formula was constructed, and I identified some strong commonalities between those two titles. Specifically, they started by giving the player, through the process of a tutorial section, 4 discrete powers or runes, and these runes became the basis of the puzzles throughout the game. So you had one rune that helped manipulate objects in the environment, which was Breath of the Wild's Magnesis, and of course Tears of the Kingdom's Ultra Hand. Then there was one which linked to time, or to change the progress of the natural world. So that was Stasis in Breath of the Wild, and then Recall in Tears of the Kingdom. Each game also had a rune whose primary goal was for combat, or at least the exertion of power over the world, bombs in Breath of the Wild and fuse in Tears of the Kingdom. I appreciate that often the bombs in Breath of the Wild weren't used for combat, but essentially they are still a means of exerting force on the world, whether on enemies or on switches. Finally, I would argue that one rune is primarily aimed at increasing the potential for traversal. Cryonis allowed users to cross rivers more easily, while Ascend in Tears of the Kingdom allows people to shoot themselves up through the ceiling. Clearly, these aren't the only things available in the two games, and you could make an argument that a far more consequential innovation in the gameplay of Breath of the Wild isn't a rune at all, but making the paraglider such a key feature of the title, expanding the concept from Skyward Sword of the sailcloth. There are also sections of the games which use the camera function, and of course there are mechanics such as weapon breakage, which are out of the control of the player. Nevertheless, what is significant about the runes, it seems to me, is that these are the powers where Aonuma and company felt able to make changes between games, even though the sum total of these changes was still to have 4 powers which focused on object manipulation, time manipulation, combat, and traversal. So how are the Echoes of Wisdom powers similar or different? Well, at first they seem different because clearly the format of having 4 shrine quests as part of an extended tutorial section is long gone. But while there aren't runes in the same way, nevertheless I think you can argue that there are 3 or perhaps even 4 core functions that players can control Zelda in order to perform. The first and the most powerful of these is clearly the Echo ability. Like Ultra Hand in Tears of the Kingdom, this is incredibly powerful and very much at the heart of the game. Fujibashi noted that a theme of Tears of the Kingdom itself was hands, and that's why you see hands in all sorts of places, such as in the entrances to shrines, and so it's clear that Ultra Hand, while notionally just one of the runes, is the most important and consequential one to the title. The Echo ability clearly here is equally important. However, I think it has quite a different role, which we'll see in a second. The other key ability in Echoes of Wisdom is the Bind ability, which allows you to manipulate and move objects at a distance, dragging them around irrespective of their weight. However, there is a version of Bind that has a separate role as well, which is called Reverse Bond. This is where you can bind Zelda to an enemy or echo, and then follow the movement of that creature, allowing you, for example, to scale walls that would normally be inaccessible just using Zelda's base abilities. Finally, Zelda can tap into Sword Fighter form and play as a progressively more powerful version of Link using the kind of skill set we got to enjoy for a couple of minutes right at the beginning of the game. Let's go back to map on the rune types that we saw for the Wild titles. Do the Echoes of Wisdom powers map on? I would argue that Bind in this case is the equivalent of Ultra Hand and Magnesis. It is a power of manipulation of objects, particularly at a distance. It is far less central in this game than in Tears of the Kingdom particularly, but of course a full 3D world is different from a largely 2D top-down map and offers a lot more potential for manipulation. Still, the key functions are the same in that they allow the main player to manipulate objects irrespective of size or weight in order to make progress in the title and to solve puzzles. Now, you might argue that this power feels a little like cheating, having massive rocks that can be waved aside by our elfin princess, or gigantic metal constructs that the rather slight Link can send soaring through the air may be huge fun, but takes us far from these core skills of the character in question. But of course, in Nintendo games, the mascot character at the heart of the title has seldom, if ever, had much to do with their abilities, as Mario demonstrates, with the portly plumber taking on, in particular in Odyssey, all sorts of different gameplay styles. And so while Western RPGs frequently try to make a logical correlation between a character's appearance and their potential to affect the world, these games by Nintendo are often reversed backwards, with great concepts for manipulating the world then grafted back onto the core characters. Having said that, even though I identified and forecast how essential this ability would be to future open-world Zeldas, I'm a little surprised to see an ability so close to Magnesis and Ultra Hand featuring in a 2D Zelda, and I think it's telling that it's used relatively sparingly. Close to Magnesis in terms of the frequency it was required, rather than Ultra Hand, although of course your playstyle may vary. Tears of the Kingdom especially tries to give you a huge level of mastery over your environment and the ability to manipulate the world around you in the way that most Action games or RPG worlds simply don't. As beautiful as they often look, it's basically a very pretty overlay for a big open space that you can run over until you hit the limitations defined in the game. This is true of all games to some degree, but Zelda has always been slightly more tactile than most, allowing you to, for example, cut the grass. Indeed, I'm reminded of how Shigeru Miyamoto wanted the Retro Studios team developing Donkey Kong Country Returns to allow Donkey Kong to blow the flowers. It wasn't so much that this would be a key gameplay element, but that it allows a level of tactility that made the world feel more real. In this sense, it doesn't really matter if the objects are moved by a mystical ability from a distance or through the, at least somewhat more plausible, power bracelets from Link's Awakening. They still have the function that the player can manipulate the environment. And the runes that took this to its greatest extent were, of course, stasis and recall, which changed time itself, at least for specific objects. Now, in a sense, we have the same idea built into bind in terms of the reverse bond. Although it is presented as a nuance in the way bind is used, in many ways it is a discrete concept in its own right that fulfills the same role. You can look at the way the mechanics of the world are working and say, right, if I change this part of how it functions, what can I achieve? Of course, the Zelda team often like to condense down powers as far as possible so that one function can, in a multiplicative fashion, have many different effects. Breath of the Wild had Cryonis as a discrete power, whereas in Tears of the Kingdom you could create blocks of ice which, while less dramatic and somewhat less durable than Breath of the Wild's, had the same broad effect. Bombs were also taken out of being a discrete power and put into the environment through bomb flowers. Granted, there are no square bombs in Tears of the Kingdom this time, but a bit of creativity with Ultra Hand, and it's possible to rig up a bomb that stays put on a flat platform in just the same way. In this case, having one function bind that combines a few different possible uses is just efficient. Of course, the big ability here, the one that grants the game its title, is the Echo ability, and of course this has a great number of functions. It is the main way to attack, and it is used heavily for traversal, using beds and water blocks to navigate from place to place. As with Ultra Hand, where it was perfectly possible to construct quite complicated weapons and send them into battle on your behalf, this is a great example of a highly flexible power, but I would argue that the core function it fulfills is, more than any other, traversal. It is literally impossible to get from place to place at many junctures without using beds or other items to cross ravines, while even the routine battling of enemies is primarily a way to allow you to access one place after another. In this sense, being able to deploy a few keys to keep your path clear, while on one level a combat tool, is more properly a means of opening up traversal, since with rare exceptions such as using sea urchins as de facto spiky weapons, you are not using the creatures you echo to directly attack yourself unless you then bind to them and then move them around personally to get in the way of enemies. They will wander around and generally help you out, but you're surrendering control to the AI most of the time. As anyone who has played the game for any length of time will realise, while both Bind and Echo do have some combat facility, the ability that really allows you to cut loose, albeit for a very limited time, is the Sword Fighter mode, where you channel the spirit of Link until your energy bar runs out. As with all these abilities, they can be used in a multitude of different ways, but I would argue that the core function here is for combat, hence the name Sword Fighter mode. So I don't think I'm stretching things too much to say that the four-part pattern of abilities introduced in Breath of the Wild and replicated in Tears of the Kingdom has found a new expression with Echoes of Wisdom. Our object manipulation tools are Magnesis, Ultra Hand, and Bind. Our tools to alter the world around us are Stasis, Recall, and Reverse Bond. Our traversal tools are Cryonis, Ascend, and Echo, while our combat-focused abilities are Bombs, Fuse, and Sword Fighter form. Clearly, they are presented differently than Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom. Zelda doesn't happen upon 4 discrete runes in Echoes of Wisdom for one thing, but nevertheless, these are core abilities which dictate the gameplay format of the genre. Now, this is very different from the classic top-down formula as we saw as recently as the remake of Link's Awakening and the remaster of Skyward Sword, where Link would progressively obtain individual items which would have specific but relatively narrow capabilities. Here we are granted specific powers relatively early, although Sword Fighter form does level up as the game progresses, giving a bit more linearity to the experience than with, let's say, Tears of the Kingdom's Fuse, where the progression was kind of innate to the kind of items you had available to fuse. The more ambitious the enemies you defeated, the better items you were able to fuse, and so the progression of the power of the fuse ability was matched precisely to the way you chose to progress through the game, rather than the way the game had set out its progression for you. The development of the Sword Fighter form is therefore less elegant, but feels more reflective of the kind of RPG-ish elements of Zelda's makeup with its classic leveling system. Of course, it's not just the 4 core powers that are replicated in this game. I've already highlighted how the smoothie system is a replication in miniature form of the cooking mechanic of the game. But the other big change is the way that the game approaches dungeons, and here things are very interesting indeed. I would say that in many respects, Skyward Sword was the apex of the pure dungeon tradition of Zelda. In that game, you would have an area that led into the dungeon, and then the dungeon itself. The thing is, the lead up to the dungeon was often equally as puzzle-oriented as the dungeon you finally reach. This format, it seems to me, was particularly replicated in Tears of the Kingdom, where some of the build-up to the dungeons were often at least as memorable and exciting as the temples at the end of the journey. Now, why is this important? Why not just go down the route, most recently demonstrated in Link's Awakening, of having a bunch of random temples scattered across the map that you can try to break into at specific points? I think largely the need for this comes from the lack of dungeon-specific items. You see, it used to be that progression in the game was gated chiefly by the abilities you had collected. A Link Between Worlds opened this up a bit, and not all games were perfectly linear, but by and large you were obliged to complete dungeons in a specific order, more or less, because the lack of certain items from the earlier dungeons gated you off from the later ones. However, the lack of these items in the modern games means it's theoretically possible to skip straight to the finale in one go, and indeed, many speedrunners in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom do. As far as I can tell, without employing some skips, that's not something which is innately possible in Echoes of Wisdom, which is an interesting departure, but nevertheless the game does require some fairly complex and puzzle-intensive traversal to even get to one of the dungeons. Obviously, even in the earlier games, there would often be overworld requirements to access one dungeon or another, but it does feel a lot denser in Echoes of Wisdom to me, where, for example, you have to do quite a lot of work with Azora before being able to access the dungeon in that region. And this makes sense, because if you think about it, you want the dungeons to feel significant and to carry some weight. And this is really hard if you can swan from one to the other, knocking them out in record time. Therefore, I think the modern format for dungeons is more rightly a long Skyward Sword style dungeon approach section within a particular region, which involves a mastery of the traversal skills within that region, followed by the dungeon itself, which tests those skills within a confined space. What is lost as a result is that sense of slight randomness in terms of the places that dungeons can turn up. Again, to use Link's Awakening as an example, because it's so small, it's kind of chaotic how much stuff is lumped into that tiny space. There's a beach next to a village, next to a forest, next to a swamp, next to a mountain, and none of these areas are really expansive enough to have much in the way of connective tissue. In the Game Boy original, this was somewhat disguised by the smaller screen, but it's really obvious in the Switch remake, where you can be loving life in Malin Village while seeing moblins skulking around in the wood just to your north, but still shown on the same screen. Personally, I love this variety and the sense of surprise that such different regions are next to each other, and while it may seem quaint now, back in the 1990s it never occurred to me that Link's Awakening had a small game map, because there was something huge around every corner, and also because it made effective use of its limited space, such as with the difficulty of navigating the mysterious forest. However, one underappreciated aspect that has become increasingly important to Zelda even as it has evolved is the distinct regions. This has been the case for a long time, of course. Even A Link to the Past had a map that was large enough to contain distinct biome areas, and in a sense it would seem crazy to have too many different types of biome squeezed into too small an area. It's only necessitated in Link's Awakening as a function of the tiny map size, and of course it's somewhat excused by the central narrative conceit of the story. But with Echoes of Wisdom's map being so much more expansive, it's not so much that the range of biomes is significantly more diverse, but that each area has more within it to explore. In a 3D game like Breath of the Wild, I think this feels a bit more natural because you have some elements recurring across the world map, such as mountains and beaches. But with Echoes of Wisdom, it soon becomes clear that the map is significantly more stratified, with particular areas given particular roles in the story. And even in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, the maps are very clearly labelled region by region, with the towers used to open these maps up a section at a time. This isn't any different to the days when Ocarina of Time had its own sections for different levels where the game would load up. It's just that by moving back to a holistic map, which allows for full traversal without interruption, those divisions from place to place do become more striking when you stop to look for them, and in some ways I think this contributes to the strange sense I had while playing Echoes of Wisdom that the Hyrule of this game didn't necessarily feel all that much more vast than little old Coeland Island. Sure, there are big plains that you can rummage around in to find heart pieces or stamps or to meet Dompe, but the absolute number of areas isn't significantly different, they're just much larger. I think this represents one of the great challenges for a game like Zelda, but indeed for most RPGs and even most games which rely strongly on particular locations. There are only so many biomes that you can really utilise, and so the potential for locations which truly feel different is limited. Now, in the past, there have been innovative approaches to tackling this. Minish Cap played around with size to create some very innovative locations, and Skyward Sword and Tears of the Kingdom together added what I hope will become as essential an element in Hyrule for future reinventions as the Lost Woods and Death Mountain have become in Zelda titles over the years, specifically the Zonai Sky Islands. These are really innovative and interesting and do feel like they add a very different flavour to the other locations. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom also played around with more technologically dense locations, particularly in the shrines, and of course occasionally there have even been stranger locations such as Jabu Jabu's Belly in Ocarina of Time. And Echoes of Wisdom of course shows a bit of independence in its interpretation of these zones. It's the Eldin Volcano rather than Death Mountain, and it's the Eternal Forest rather than the Lost Woods. Still, we are very much in the territory that the mainline 3D Zeldas have been in for a long time now, of remixing existing locations rather than creating something brand new. And it's not clear that they can do something all that different. Throw a stone into any game lineup and you're going to hit a game which has a fire level, an ice level, a grasslands biome, and so on. The Xenoblade series, which of course is developed by Monolith Soft, who also contributed heavily to the Wild games on Switch, is particularly effective at finding strange and unusual locations that are an innovative twist on what you might expect. Nevertheless, if we're looking at a core Zelda formula, for these game developers, the map of Hyrule offers a huge amount of benefit to them when they're trying to mind map ideas of what kind of locations they want to build, because the map suggests already multiple different types of biomes and therefore multiple types of different gameplay which could follow from it even before they've started developing any actual title. I may do a separate video on how Hyrule as or may evolve, but suffice to say that being able to reinvent their castle town, their volcano, their icy mountains, their watery kingdom and so on gives them something to bounce off from each time. Clearly they don't do the same take on each kingdom each time. One of the regions that appears in the Wild titles has a quite different take on the major species that reside there, redolent of a character type from a different past Zelda title. Nevertheless, far from being some sprawling, shapeless open world, it is very clear that Zelda relies on the mythology of these distinct kingdoms. Sure, they may innovate with one area or another, but the fact that they always have a good bank of strong concepts to reinvent, such as the Goron and the Zora, must at least help to give a shape to the game design before they start creating. What does surprise me a little about this game, though, is the extent to which progression is gated to at least some degree by the placement of the rifts. I'm not big into game breaking, so I'm sure some players will and probably already have figured out ways to massively skip areas of the story, but there is still a much bigger concession to a traditional structure in the way Echoes of Wisdom presents itself than in Breath of the Wild. Now, once you get into the later parts of the game, things open up considerably, but I wonder whether future top-down games will continue to push the theme of openness, or whether they will be happy with the somewhat gated but still broadly open approach that they've taken with the Echoes of Wisdom world map. Because ultimately, from the structure of the world map and the sequence of the dungeons, flows the narrative. You see, whereas many Western games are designed with some kind of high concept or narrative first, the Nintendo approach has always been to create the game mechanics first and then sweat the details of the story later, if at all. Partly as a byproduct of using the well-known world of Hyrule rather than a different world each time, there are certain narrative beats that just logically follow. If you're going to have dungeons in each section of the world, it follows that you need to have key characters there. In Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, the champions and later the sages put a face to the locations in a way that makes these places compelling, and while I won't go too much into the way Echoes of Wisdom works, suffice to say that there are memorable characters in each location, and since it's already featured in the press, I can say that the River and Sea Zora are an example of where they've taken different approaches to previous Switch Zeldas by digging into some slightly deeper cut content. However, I do rather wonder if the imposition of such strict formulae, not even in the post-Wild games but going back and back and back, is slightly limiting the scope of what Zelda can be. Spirit Tracks feels like the last time that Zelda really threw out the bathwater, baby and all, and committed to something really strange and different. Since then, we've had not just more recapitulations of the core Zelda story like Skyward Sword, which took some elements and remixed them, but actually new versions, such as in Breath of the Wild and Echoes of Wisdom, which are based within the same kingdoms that we've seen previously, and which are more and more traditional in style in many respects. It's particularly striking when the previous game in the top-down 2D line was the stunning, and yet completely off-the-wall, Link's Awakening. The thing about Link's Awakening is that it doesn't just create a different world, although it certainly does. It's not just the strange pastiche elements, although frankly, given how changeable the world of Hyrule is, what harm could it do to have the odd element from a different franchise show up? Why not see Chain Chomp's back? If a Kirby-esque character can be a villain, why not an Inkling-style enemy? How cool would that be? But none of that is what truly makes Link's Awakening. It's the story where you fall in love with this wonderful little location and these funny, endearing people, and then set about a quest which, well, I won't spoil it, but suffice to say that the closer you get to the ending, the more heart-rending the game becomes, and actually, it's one that gets harder with every replay. I absolutely adore Link's Awakening, and while part of that is pure nostalgia for the 1993 original, which was one of the very first Nintendo games I ever played, I also think it is a staggering work of genius, although perhaps that's a topic for another video. However, the story and characters are not separated out. We don't have a section with character set A and then we topple over to character set B. We have characters weaving in and out of the story throughout. This is something we see a little in the Wild titles with characters like Purah and Robbie, and without spoiling Echoes of Wisdom, there is a moment of some consequence towards the early middle of the story, featuring a number of key characters, but generally speaking, these are lonely, isolated quests. That works fine for Breath of the Wild. The whole concept of that game is that you are completely isolated and alone, surviving in the wilds of this new Hyrule. But I do miss having characters like Malin, where your relationship deepens over time, and not just when you have a new dungeon to beat. And let's not overstate it. Malin has less character development in terms of time than surely any of the sages from Tears of the Kingdom, but her impact from that development time is far, far greater. And we've seen other characters over the years, Groose from Skyward Sword is another one, who are hugely memorable and have moving character arcs. So what happened to stories that crazy and off the wall? One answer, I fear, is the loss to the Zelda team of Yoshiaki Koizumi, the genius behind the story of Link's Awakening and a major player in Majora's Mask. Koizumi's stand is still at Nintendo, of course, but he's now incredibly senior and is unlikely to be sticking his fingers too much in the Zelda pie. Hidemaru Fujibayashi has made it clear that for the Wild games the story was very much a late addition, and that although Tears of the Kingdom began life as DLC for Breath of the Wild, and so it was known that it would sequelize many aspects of that world, they only developed the actual story late on. In the case of Echoes of Wisdom, Eiji Aonuma describes the story writing process, and it's less than inspiring. He said, "Even there, Grozzo didn't offer any in-depth suggestions about the story at first, so I went back to the hotel, quickly wrote a script that would work, and brought it with me the next day. Then we all contributed various elements that often occur in the Legend of Zelda series to the script. Using this method, we eventually completed the game's story." Basically, he just took lots of things that normally happen in the Zelda story, stitched them together, and created a plot. Eiji Aonuma does have some creative and interesting ideas that are at the heart of Echoes of Wisdom, and I think there are some pretty cool concepts that are added to the Zelda mythos. Still, it's not the most inspiring way to create an epic new story. To be clear, Yoshiaki Koizumi was in much the same boat on Link's Awakening. Indeed, it seems that because the story was such an afterthought on the Game Boy Zelda, he basically got away with going off the wall with it and doing something really strange and distinctive. I also don't want it to sound like I'm overly down on the story of the Wild titles and Echoes of Wisdom. The fugitive theme in Echoes of Wisdom is good fun and feels more plausible than I expected, for a Zelda game anyway. Meanwhile, in Tears of the Kingdom in particular, I was really gripped by the mystery of what had become of Zelda, and I felt compelled to search out the Dragon Tears. Regrettably, because of the non-linear distribution of the tears, it was obvious fairly quickly what had happened, but nevertheless, the revelation of Zelda's true fate is, I think, rather epic and does lead to a suitably dramatic conclusion. I still really like the Tears of the Kingdom plot. In essence, the plot of a modern Zelda game serves to key up both the central conflict and the sub-conflicts. The central conflict is linked to the game's end goal in general. In the case of Breath of the Wild, is to defeat Calamity Ganon. In the case of Echoes of Wisdom, there are a few more steps in between, perhaps reflecting the fact that it would be extraordinarily difficult in a game of the limited size of a top-down Zelda to create a challenge gauntlet sufficient that you could keep determined players from finishing the title in half an hour right out of the wrapper. But then each individual region represents an opportunity to have a new subplot, and the structure of these is usually fairly familiar. We have a character or set of characters in some kind of crisis, and the intervention of the protagonist helps to resolve this crisis and hopefully bring some kind of emotional closure and deeper understanding to the inhabitants of the region. Some of these plots are more evolved than others. I was a particular fan of Tulin's character arc in Tears of the Kingdom, while the bickering of the river and sea Zora in Echoes of Wisdom is good fun and feels like a fresh take on a Zora narrative. There are also different opportunities for set pieces. One of my favourite moments in Tears of the Kingdom is the Siege of Gerudo Town, and Echoes of Wisdom also has a midpoint set piece set in one of the town locations. Now, you might think that this seems perfectly sensible as a narrative structure. Each part of the map has not just a self-contained dungeon and set of challenges, but its own narrative arc. These arcs may not be hugely complex, but I don't think most people turn to frothy Japanese action titles for deep narrative riches. However, I think it's worth comparing this story format to the way that some of the previous Zelda titles operated, and in this case, I'll focus on Skyward Sword and Link's Awakening. As part of this, while I will try to avoid spoiling Link's Awakening flat out, I strongly urge you to skip forward to the next timestamp if you haven't played the game. It is truly one of the most beautiful narratives of all time in any medium, and it just deserves to be experienced in all its beauty as fresh as you can. So in the case of Link's Awakening, we open with a mystery of Link being shipwrecked and the suggestion that the island might not be what it seems. Gradually, all these key themes are progressed through the character of the owl and the various revelations within the dungeons about the true nature of the windfish and Koholint Island itself. Separately, there are midpoint twists in the plot, which go back to Maid Village, both saving Bow Wow from the moblins and then bringing Marin along to Animal Village. Of course, we have that brilliant and poignant shoreline scene, and Marin has a key appearance at the very end of the story. Instead of each part of the story reinforcing separate, distinct narrative strands, which are then closed down once you've obtained the dungeon MacGuffin or been granted the magical seal of plot divisiveness, each section of the game's story doubles down on the core plot. These aren't grand narrative arcs, but we're just involved in the characters' day-to-day lives in a way that makes us feel embedded in the village, connected to the people, and yet simultaneously we have a growing awareness of the terrible consequences of waking the windfish. The upshot is that instead of the plot having a broad structure with discrete and disconnected episodes, it has a deep structure which is focused on giving the player an evolving experience and many continual chances to experience this cast of characters. In this sense, Breath of the Wild is actually closer to the Link's Awakening structure in some ways. Because the core narrative is essentially Link's survival in the wild and how he comes to be powerful enough to seize the kingdom back from Calamity Ganon, it turns every experience Link has into a self-directed piece of narrative. I remember people commenting early on when Breath of the Wild was released that every choice you made formed your own version of the narrative. For me, I first left the Great Plateau and headed in the direction of Gerudo Desert, and so my memories of that early playtime are indelibly linked to that experience, whereas for other people they may remember setting out in a quite different direction. However, I didn't have the same sense of the narrative coming through the discovery of the world in Tears of the Kingdom, partly because the world was not new to the same degree, and partly because its structure encouraged huge leaps across the map, so unless you specifically decided to go slow and absorb each section at a time, the game was quite content to let you boop around through the skies from one discrete part of the map to another in a way that inevitably became disconnected. Moreover, while Breath of the Wild did involve Link gradually uncovering the dark history of this new Hyrule, the Tears of the Kingdom narrative was far more linked to the discovery of the Tears, which, while fun in their own way, and I was very excited to find them, were only one narrative element in this vast world. The Breath of the Wild memories were fundamental to what this Hyrule was. They were connected deeply to the central mystery, whereas with Tears of the Kingdom, this was tied to a specific, although incredibly important, narrative arc. Skyward Sword is far, far smaller in scope, and I don't think its Skyloft is anywhere near as well defined as Koholint Island, but we do have an example of Groose as a character with both a strong narrative and character arc. Cruce's storyline isn't all that central to other redemption arc characters like Yunobo in Tears of the Kingdom, but because it's so central to the narrative, it feels more important, and we're forced to experience it over a longer time. There are some hints at through-line characters in Echoes of Wisdom, such as suggestions that Tri is gradually learning to understand Hylian emotions and the references to Link's traumatic past, but it's all very softly. Are we completely done then in the Zelda universe with strong central narratives? Are they a thing of the past, and are we moving through to a modular plot approach? Well, look, I don't think we can ever count out narratives returning to centrality in the games. Narratives are some of the cheapest and best special effects you can get for games. Undertale looks like it would be at home on the Famicom, but has one of the most moving and profound stories in all of gaming. But since Nintendo's approach leaves narrative very much as an afterthought, until or unless Yoshiaki Koizumi steps into Shinya Takahashi's shoes and mandates a stronger focus on narrative, or until or unless we get another Koizumi-style creative mind who is simultaneously given outrageous freedom to take this now storied franchise in a strange and potentially controversial new direction, I fear we will remain in the era of Zelda games having fairly perfunctory narratives. Okay, besides narratives, how else is this larger and more developed world utilized in Echoes of Wisdom, and how does this compare to the Wild games? One of the major differences between the Wild titles and Echoes of Wisdom is the lack of shrines. Well, sort of. There are places where the still world needs fixing, but these are not sufficiently numerous enough, and nor are they really varied enough to be called shrines exactly. They do fulfill a similar kind of function though, which is to append to the world little gameplay experiences which don't take up space on the map, but which do allow for brief challenges. The sandbox Mario games take the same approach, of course, whether by use of paintings in Super Mario 64 or accessing different challenge levels for moons in Super Mario Odyssey. Echoes of Wisdom isn't quite large enough a map to need a surfeit of these, and it has a larger number of dungeons or dungeon-like experiences in any event. It's easy to see the benefit of these kinds of experiences for a game developer though. You can discreetly create a number of challenge levels using the same resources, over 100 in the case of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, and then flexibly drop them in and out of the map at will. The Echoes of Wisdom still world sections are a little bit more specific, as they carve out sections of the game world that the Rift is pulled from, which is a nice touch. I think what's curious to me about these is that although there's a small amount of puzzle solving, they are very much focused on combat, and I'm not quite sure what the thinking was here by including them. My guess is that they felt that the nature of the Echo abilities and not giving Zelda much facility in her own right to initiate combat was considered puzzle enough, and so having these mainly be challenges that centre on traversal and combat was considered intrinsically puzzling, without the need to hide the hidden relatives of try in particularly strange or obscure places. Will this hold true if Nintendo decides to have a more traditional combat option in future Zelda titles? I'm not sure. It does seem to me that Nintendo wants to balance out combat and puzzle solving, and so it would only make sense if they do end up with a combat focus on the next title. I certainly think caves are something that we can expect to continue in the Zelda series, and not just because, of course, there have always been caves in Zelda, and indeed the very first Zelda title started in a cave. But I am, of course, talking about the caves being discrete little challenge gauntlets with puzzles or enemies to take down. Hidemaru Fujibashi has talked about a big aim for Tears of the Kingdom being seamlessness, and the caves certainly suit that aspiration, providing the ability for characters to dip in and out of the maps. I could even see the shrines in the main open-air games ultimately being superseded by challenge areas that are integrated into the world without loading screens, as if you look at the entrances to Tears of the Kingdom shrines, it's clear that they at least made some effort to match the entrances to the beginning of the shrines in such a way that it suggests that Link is seamlessly stepping through a rift. Perhaps a remastered version of Tears of the Kingdom could even cut down that loading time entirely and make it seem completely seamless. Of course, this again takes us far from the original formula of 2D Zelda and is a function of the sheer scale of the map. Sure, there were always the odd bobbable sections hidden away, but having discrete challenge caves that are eminently skippable is a function of the desire for the game to be both vast and to reward deep exploration without pushing the player down any particular mandated path. This has lots of advantages for the player, but for the programming team it also means that they need to create material that may never ultimately be encountered by a number of players, and so it is only efficient to have a repeatable structure such as the caves or the shrines. For completionists this may feel a bit more repetitive, but I suspect for many casual players these will never wear out their welcome. Obviously, a major way that Echoes of Wisdom feels different to classic Zeldas is in terms of items. Dungeon items are flat out gone, but so too are the kinds of weapons that would litter the shrines of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. I did find that as I was exploring the world in Echoes of Wisdom that the treasure chests often felt kind of anticlimactic. Every now and then there was some amazing loot, but sometimes you just be given a handful of Electro Apples or some other item, which, well fine, are the kind of thing that in Tears of the Kingdom you just scrump off the ground while running from A to B, and don't really feel like a reward for a bit of puzzle solving. I think to some degree this is a symptom of the lack of weapons in the game. Since all traditional weapons are wielded only in sword fighter mode, the game's chief reward is in echoes, which aren't available through treasure chests, and as a result I feel like the game's reward system is a little unbalanced. Usually in the Hero of the Wild titles, a shrine's treasure chest could reliably contain some kind of weapon, and while they might not always be that exciting, occasionally you come across something really quite fun. Instead, Zelda is mostly rewarded with smoothie ingredients. Of course, one overworld feature that does make a welcome return are the heart pieces scattered in the overworld. Now, I'm actually a huge fan of shrines, and especially as a way to boost stamina and hearts, but pieces of hearts fit this kind of title, a smaller top-down Zelda, far more readily as they can just be dropped into the world. That same sense of joy when you spot a shrine is replicated when you spot a piece of heart, even if it's not immediately clear how to get to it. Creating compelling item drops is important to the gameplay loop of these games, and I suspect in this case, future games will benefit from having weapons back, even though it's not something that might have been prioritized in recent games. This also points us to another key difference between Echoes of Wisdom and the Wild titles, which is the lack of a stamina bar. I always felt that stamina was a great innovation from Skyward Sword, but of course the concept of an energy depletion mechanic still exists in the magic meter for the sword fighter form. Evidently the notion of a magic meter has been a recurring part of Zelda from Adventure of Link through to Skyward Sword, and so it's not astonishing to see it recur here in a different form. As for stamina, I think it is clearly not needed in this game. It's not just that traversal doesn't take as long as in the much more vast world of Hyrule of the Wild, but there are also other limits on Zelda's abilities to travel the land as opposed to Link's, specifically the limitations of Tri's ability to generate echoes. This has the same function of ensuring that the player doesn't become too powerful too quickly, while also allowing late game players to have a lot more latitude to get around the map without undue hindrance. So far we've looked pretty squarely at the elements that have been lifted from the wild titles, and these are many. Eiji Aonuma went so far in a recent interview as to note that he asked the developers, and I quote, to think of ways to add some freedom. Having worked on games of the Legend of Zelda series over the years, we started to feel that fans may not continue playing this franchise unless they can think independently and try various things freely on their own, rather than following a set path. Even when it comes to solving puzzles, in a game in the Legend of Zelda series, having the excitement of solving puzzles in your own unique way makes the game Legend of Zelda-like. Hence, we need to increase the degree of freedom to achieve that. With this in mind, I asked Grezzo to use those elements as a foundation for the gameplay and add freedom on top of it. It's curious that the idea of games being this free is still relatively recent, with 2013's A Link Between Worlds being the first title in the series for a very long time to open itself up to that degree, and even then, only tentatively in some respects, with it being very much an experiment ahead of Breath of the Wild. How far we've come that Legend of Zelda-like is now defined as having that excitement of solving puzzles in your own way. Nevertheless, Echoes of Wisdom does have plenty of DNA from past entries in the 2D series. One thing I found especially interesting was the inclusion of a 2D side-scrolling section, and not just a small number of them either. Time and time again, I'd enter a section and find myself side-scrolling. I guess the advantage of having side view elements here is similar to the advantage of having the shrines or still world segments branch out of the main game world, specifically expansion. It's possible to do a lot more with the side view in the game location, and it may also have some benefits for avoiding overly long load times as well. Plus, since the method for canvassing ideas from the team at Grezzo seemed to have been quite open, it made sense that people would consider ideas for both side-scrolling and top-down forms of gameplay, and I guess the mechanics that had been built for Link's Awakening already included these side-scrolling sections, so it would be a waste not to reuse them, especially as they had a deep history within 2D Zelda games, and this does open the possibility that, until now, I had thought very unlikely, some kind of remake of Zelda 2. The Adventure of Link was never one of the better received titles in the series due to its difficult challenge level, but if in the next generation Grezzo once again takes the approach of doing 2 games within the lifespan of the console, a remake of a past game that is used to build assets, and then an original title piggybacking off that work, well, if that were the case, Adventure of Link would be a very interesting shout for a starting point. While I think it might frustrate the developers at Grezzo to go backward to something as limited as even the Link's Awakening game, a title so perfect and beautiful that it just needed honouring, the less rapturous reception of Zelda 2 perhaps gives more scope for it to be reinvented in places or adapted more liberally, perhaps in the manner of Metroid Samus Returns for the 3DS. In fact, it's worth recalling journalistic outlet Jez Video's interview with Eiji Aonuma back in 2017. They asked, Metroid Samus Returns, the remake of an important yet not the most popular episode in the series, was announced at E3. Do you think that a remake of Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, which has a similar history, would be a good idea? Eiji Aonuma responded, would you like that? Well, think about it. While Eiji Aonuma has a long habit of teasing future Zelda titles in interviews, in this case the initiative of the question appears to be with the outlet, and so I don't necessarily think that we're on the cusp of some great Adventure of Link reinvention, just like Metroid Prime 2 being reinvented as Samus Returns. Apart from anything else, Grezzo seem now far too established in making original Zeldas for a return to a prior title at this point, especially one that's already on NSO. What I do think, though, is that as part of rethinking the conventions of a 2D Zelda, they have looked not just at the low-hanging fruit of A Link to the Past, but have considered all aspects of what made 2D Zelda work, and so these side-scrolling sections will likely continue to have a major place. All things considered, I think the next 2D Zelda, being a remake, has to be about a 30% chance, and if it is, the obvious one to remake would still be the beloved A Link to the Past, or even the original game, which has come close to being remade multiple times over the years. Still, with those titles already available on NSO, I would say there has to be a 10% chance outright that the next Grezzo Zelda is a Zelda 2 remake, which could stand to have a much more substantial revision than either of the other two more iconic and beloved games. At any rate, the other great inheritance of the 2D titles is more complicated dungeons. Now, this isn't always the case. The games contain a variety of different dungeons. There was one which I entered and got instantly excited because it appeared to be on multiple levels with some complicated looking mechanics at the heart. Then I realised it was another take on that old chestnut, the 5 key dungeons seen in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, especially where one dungeon was essentially 5 different mini-missions which allowed you to open a door to the boss. Superficial complexity, masking a modular structure that was anything but complex. However, the game does scale up the complexity of the dungeons significantly, and by the end I personally was satisfied with at least 1 or 2 of the dungeons, even if I would have enjoyed a few more in the style of some of the later ones. What seems to have gone from the earlier games is any direct reference to sequencing. The original Zelda and Link's Awakening were both very direct about this labelling of their dungeons as Level 1, Level 2 and so on, while Skyward Sword hid its arguably even more linear structure behind a good degree of backtracking. I think there's still, in Echoes of Wisdom, a preferred order to the dungeons. In Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom and Echoes of Wisdom, there is a notably different challenge curve if you do them in a specific order, but I think this is less of a case as there being some kind of ideal order, and more a case of ensuring that for players of lower skill, there is always something accessible without forcing more advanced players to follow the diktats of the game's developers. I also think there's one curious commonality in many recent games in terms of dungeons. If we're thinking about areas of the maps that aren't full-on dungeons but do include a dungeon-like experience, the one area that stands out in Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, and Echoes of Wisdom is Hyrule Castle. In Breath of the Wild, Hyrule Castle felt almost like a 5th dungeon, or a 6th if you include the DLC, as it was a complex and maze-like structure with lots of challenging elements contained within. But it was more of a physical challenge than a puzzle, especially as no particularly clever puzzle solving was needed to push through it. Still, Hyrule Castle in Echoes of Wisdom and the Yiga clan hideout in Breath of the Wild introduced that most controversial of mechanics to our dear little game world, the stealth missions. I'm not really a fan of these, but it does seem that stealth missions, which date back to at least Ocarina of Time as far as I can think, are now embedded as a core function within both 3D and now 2D Zelda, and it definitely allows for a different style of challenge besides the traditional temples. Indeed, the number of traditional temples seems to be lower in modern games, even though the amount of overall content seems to be higher, and I guess this reflects a wish to be less structurally rigid in terms of levels with puzzles and to have more shorter form challenges in between. I do think it's interesting that there is such a range of exceedingly linear dungeons, where even if it seems like you're backtracking, the game pretty much literally opens the door for you to go from room to room in a linear manner, through to the aforementioned modular dungeons with different sections to complete, through to the occasional more classic experience, which is a little more challenging. This gives me at least some hope that the chances for more elaborate puzzle boxes are not completely lost in the new world of Hyrule for the open air games as well, even though structurally the Tears of the Kingdom temples, while lots of fun in their own ways, didn't really scratch the same itch for me. In fact, while there's no evidence to support this theory, I do wonder whether the later dungeons were also developed later in the process of making Echoes of Wisdom, and so the increased complexity may not have been just a natural ramp-up of the challenge level, but also a response to the negative reaction to the Tears of the Kingdom temples. In this theory, it would be the case that A.J. Aonuma had heard the criticism of Tears of the Kingdom and asked the Echoes of Wisdom team to incorporate some more challenging dungeons. We know that the Zelda team are responsive to feedback. Look how the Skyward Sword reaction triggered a complete about turn in Breath of the Wild, and to a lesser degree, how they trumpeted the return of themed dungeons in Tears of the Kingdom as a triumphant way to address previous fan concern. It can't have escaped their notice that while the Tears of the Kingdom dungeons did have their advantages, particularly with the strong theming, they were still a long way from the kind of masterfully intricate puzzle boxes that were in the Zelda games of yore. And if they noticed it, they still have the potential to make changes in Echoes of Wisdom, at least for some of the later dungeons. Of course, something else influencing the challenge level is probably the involvement as a director of Tomomi Sato, who seems to have been a moderating influence on the team during Majora's Mask 3D, as someone who found the original title too unfairly challenging and wanted to see the title be a little more accessible in the remake. Nevertheless, I'm a lot more optimistic that future top-down games at a minimum will continue to have strong dungeon content, but it also feels plausible to me that the next title from Fujibashi's team will also push the envelope at least a little bit more in terms of dungeon design. I grant you that this may be a reflection more of hope than recent experience, but let's not forget that as well as being the director of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, Hidemaru Fujibashi also captained Oracles of Ages, Oracles of Seasons, Minish Cap, and Skyward Sword, all of which had very mighty dungeons. One thing that does seem destined to change going into the next generation is the art style. If you read between the lines of Eiji Onuma's statement in the recent developer interviews for Echoes of Wisdom, he as good as confirms that they will be moving on from the dioramic style, as he says. Amid all this, we feel that the remake of The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening on Nintendo Switch, which we developed with Grezzo, had become our new approach in terms of graphics and gameplay feel, as a top-down Legend of Zelda game for the Nintendo Switch generation. Now, it may be that when he said for the Nintendo Switch generation, he was just reflecting the fact that there has been no subsequent generation, but a glance back over prior handheld Zeldas showed that they generally stick to one style per system. Link's Awakening and the Oracles titles shared a look on the dear old Game Boy, while the Toon Link aesthetic was carried over from Phantom Hourglass to Spirit Tracks. Even on 3DS, Triforce Heroes resurrected the A Link Between World look. The only tragedy in all this is that the Game Boy Advance never survived long enough for the glorious artistic style of Minish Cap to get another outing, unless of course you count the Minish-ish Cadence of Hyrule aesthetic. Obviously, the look of those games isn't really tied fundamentally to the game's mechanics. It's not clear to me that Wind Waker and Twilight Princess are significantly different in terms of complexity and gameplay style and challenge, just because one looks like a playable cartoon and the other has a moody, shadowy, pensive look. But while in the Fujibashi titles, there seems to have been a happy compromise reached in principle, if not in specific look, between a broadly realistic overall aesthetic and cel-shaded detailing to give the world an almost Princess Mononoke look, the field is a lot more open for top-down Zelda. I don't know that there's any benefit to offering a forecast on this, as the field is so incredibly open, so suffice to say, I'll be intrigued to see where they take the graphical style of the games next. So, circling back to Echoes of Wisdom, what have we learned? In many ways, the new formula does seem to take on board heavy influences from the open-air games of the Switch era. The map is both more open and yet carefully segmented to softly guide the player through. The narrative is more modular in line with the Wild games, and the structure of the map contains a balance of smaller, discoverable mini-puzzles in the form of caves, stamp challenges and still world segments akin to the caves, shrines and Koroks of Tears of the Kingdom. The dungeons seem a little more complex by the end, but are still broadly showing the same DNA, and the use of extended puzzle sections leading up to the dungeons or non-dungeon challenge areas with stealth missions and such like help to build up the variety. The new formula seems agnostic about the use of side-scrolling 2D and top-down action, with both being incorporated effectively into the gameplay. And most critically, it is built very strongly around central powers linked to traversal, manipulation of the environment, manipulation of objects, and combat. Powers which are introduced right at the beginning of the game and which continue to be critically important through to the end. I still think 4 powers in some form will continue to recur through future Zelda titles. Which just leaves us the question: if this is the new formula for Zelda, how long until the tea table is once again upturned? Tears of the Kingdom very clearly falls into the pattern left by Breath of the Wild, but then again, it's a direct sequel. But Echoes of Wisdom, to also borrow so heavily from the formula, suggests that a lot has been internalised and is part of their ongoing way of proceeding with Zelda titles. Indeed, Eiji Aonuma's comments in the developer interviews reflect the fact that this openness is now considered not just an optional extra, but absolutely fundamental to the Legend of Zelda formula in his view. If you enjoyed this video, I really suggest checking out my similar deep dives of the mechanics of Tears of the Kingdom, which is pinging its way onto the screen even now. I also have some exclusives on my Patreon, so please consider supporting the channel on there. But even if not, I remain deeply grateful to you for watching the content, and I hope to see you again very soon for another Nintendo Forecast.